The wind on the high plains of Wyoming had a voice, and in the winter of 1884, it spoke of nothing but loss. Caleb Thorne knew its language well. He'd been fluent in it for 3 years, ever since the influenza had swept through his home like a phantom thief, stealing the warmth of his wife, Sarah, and the bright, bubbling laughter of his 4-year-old son, Daniel. Now, the wind was his only constant companion as he rode the perimeter of his ranch, his shoulders hunched against a premature flurry of snow that bit at his exposed skin. His horse, a sturdy roan named Dust Devil, picked its way through the rust-colored earth and stubborn sagebrush, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Caleb's gaze was distant, sweeping over the vast, empty expanse that was both his kingdom and his prison. He saw the ghosts of his past etched into the landscape. Over by the cottonwoods near the creek, Sarah had spread a blanket for a picnic one sun-drenched afternoon. By the rough-hewn fence of the corral, Daniel had taken his first wobbly steps, his tiny hands gripping Caleb's calloused finger. Every rock, every twisted juniper tree, held a memory that was a fresh twist of the knife in his gut. He was a man carved from the land itself, hard, quiet, and weathered. His face was a roadmap of sun and sorrow, with the lines etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. Solitude wasn't a punishment, it was a penance. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk. The physical exhaustion a welcome drug that sometimes, if he was lucky, kept the nightmares at bay. He spoke more to his cattle and his horse than he did to any human soul in the nearby town of Redemption. He had nothing left to say. The words had died with his family. As he crested the last rise before his homestead, a flicker of movement near the old Miller place caught his eye. The cabin had been abandoned for 5 years, its windows boarded up, its frame slowly surrendering to the elements. But now, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a pale, fragile signal against the darkening sky. Caleb reined in Dust Devil, his brow furrowed. No one in their right mind would choose to winter in that derelict shack. It was a place for coyotes and ghosts, not people. He watched for a long moment as a slender figure in a dark dress emerged, battling the wind to retrieve a fallen piece of laundry. A woman, alone. A knot of unease tightened in Caleb's stomach. This was a disruption, a crack in the carefully constructed emptiness of his world. He nudged his horse forward, not towards the strange woman, but towards the familiar silence of his own cabin, hoping that if he ignored the smoke, it might simply disappear. It did not. The next day, he saw her again. A small, determined shape, trying to patch a hole in the dilapidated roof with a piece of scavenged tin. He knew who she was before he even heard the whispers in town. Eliza Mayhew, her husband, a miner with more ambition than sense, had been killed in a rockfall at the quarry a month prior, leaving her with a mountain of debt and the pitying, judgmental stares of the townsfolk. For a week, Caleb watched her from a distance. He saw her chopping wood with a grim tenacity that her frail frame seemed ill-suited for. He saw her carrying buckets of water from the creek, her steps slow but steady. They lived less than half a mile apart, 2 islands of grief in a sea of unforgiving wilderness. Yet they never spoke. He was a man who had buried his heart. She was a woman trying to keep hers from freezing. There were no words for that. The first heavy snow of the season changed things. It came down thick and fast, a white blanket that threatened to smother everything. Caleb was securing his livestock when he heard a sharp crack, followed by a muffled cry. His head snapped up. The sound had come from the Miller place. Cursing under his breath, he threw a saddle on the Dust Devil and rode through the blizzard. He found her on the ground beside the cabin, a small pile of broken shingles next to her. The makeshift patch on the roof had given way, and a section of the rotting wood had come down with it. She was pale, her dark hair dusted with snow, but her eyes, when she looked up at him, were clear and defiant. "I'm all right," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as she tried to push herself up. Caleb dismounted without a word. He looked from her to the gaping hole in her roof, then back to her. "No, ma'am, you're not." That was their first real conversation. It was as sparse and brittle as the winter landscape. He helped her inside, his touch brief and impersonal. The cabin was even worse than he'd imagined. Drafty, bare, and cold. Despite the small fire crackling in the hearth, there was a profound sadness clinging to the air, a grief so palpable it felt like a physical presence. He noticed a small, crudely carved wooden cradle in the corner, empty. He'd heard the whispers about that. Too, a son, born still and silent, just weeks before her husband's death. He didn't offer sympathy. He knew how useless it was, like offering a thimble of water to a man dying of thirst. Instead, he offered what he had. "Stay by your fire," he commanded gruffly. "I'll fix it." He worked for the rest of the day. The hammer blows a steady rhythm against the howl of the wind. He was a man who understood things that were broken. He couldn't fix his own life, but he could mend a roof. Eliza brought him a cup of hot, bitter coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she passed it to him. They didn't speak. They just existed in the shared space. Two solitary figures acknowledging a debt of necessity, not kindness. When he was done, the patch was solid, ugly but functional. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, standing in the doorway. "Ma'am," he nodded, tipping his hat before turning and riding back into the storm. The silence of his own home calling to him. He had done his neighborly duty. That would be the end of it. But in a town as small as Redemption, nothing was ever the end of it. When Caleb went to the general store for supplies the following week, he felt the change in the air. The usual hum of conversation quieted as he entered. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress and town's primary source of gossip, gave him a knowing look over her spectacles. Samuel Blackwood, the store owner, was suddenly overly polite. He heard a snippet of conversation as he passed the pickle barrel. Two women pretending to inspect calico fabric. Shameful is what it is. A widow, barely a month in mourning, latching onto the first lonely rancher she sees. Caleb's jaw tightened. He paid for his flour and salt pork, his movement stiff, and left without a word. He knew what they were thinking. They saw a vulnerable widow and a reclusive rancher and painted their own sordid story. They couldn't comprehend the simple, shared language of loss. They saw weakness and opportunity, not two people just trying to survive the winter. Eliza felt their stares even more keenly. She was the town's tragedy, and now, its scandal. She went about her business with her head held high, her face a mask of quiet composure. She took in laundry from the boarding house, her fingers raw from the harsh soap and icy water. Working late into the night by the light of a single tallow candle, she avoided eye contact, offered polite, clipped responses when spoken to, and retreated back to her cold, lonely cabin as soon as she could. She was building a wall around herself, stone by silent stone, and she prayed it would be high enough. The tenuous piece of their isolated existence was shattered by the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach. 2 weeks before Christmas, it was the last one that would make it through before the pass was snowed in for the season. Caleb was in his barn, mending a harness. When he heard the rumble of its wheels and the jingle of the team's bells, he paid it no mind until he heard a frantic shout. "Eliza! Eliza Mayhew!" He stepped out of the barn and saw the coach driver gesturing wildly towards Eliza's cabin. A figure was stumbling out of the stagecoach, a woman in a pale blue dress wholly unsuited for the weather, her face a mess of tears. Eliza emerged from her cabin, her expression alarmed. The woman ran towards her, collapsing into her arms with a sob that seemed to tear from the very depths of her soul. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the family resemblance. This was her sister. He turned to go back inside, wanting no part of this new drama, but the coach driver, a portly man named Hank, called out to him, Mr. Thorne, glad I caught you. Storm's blowing in fierce. This is the last run till spring. Caleb just grunted in acknowledgement. His eyes were drawn back to the two women. The sister was younger, her hair a brighter shade of corn silk blonde, her form less worn down by hardship. But her grief was raw and wild. A stark contrast to Eliza's quiet, contained sorrow. He watched as Eliza led her sister inside the cabin. The stagecoach rumbled away, leaving behind a profound silence, now charged with a new, unwelcome energy. The storm Hank had predicted arrived with a vengeance. A full-blown blizzard that raged for 2 days, trapping them all in their respective shelters. When the storm finally broke, the world was a pristine, blinding white. Caleb was digging a path to his woodshed when he saw Eliza trudging through the deep snow towards his cabin. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence. I have a favor to ask. An impossible one." Caleb leaned on his shovel, waiting. "It's my sister, Clara. She has nowhere else to go." The story tumbled out of her in a rush of shame and desperation. Clara was supposed to have been married 2 days ago, to a respectable merchant in Cheyenne. But at the altar, in front of the entire town, the man had called off the wedding. He'd accused her of impropriety, of not being the pure bride he was promised. He had publicly shamed her and cast her out. Her parents, mortified and disgraced, had put her on the first stagecoach heading west, telling her not to return. "She can't stay with me," Eliza finished, her gaze falling to the snow at her feet. "The cabin. It's too small, too cold. There's barely room for one, and with the pass closed." Caleb stared at her, his mind a turmoil of conflicting emotions. Pity warred with a fierce desire to protect his solitude. He looked past her, towards the shabby cabin where another broken heart now resided. His ranch, his sanctuary of silence, was being besieged by the sorrows of the world. "Please," Eliza whispered. "Just until the pass clears in the spring. She can work. She's strong." He thought of the long, brutal months ahead. He thought of the empty stall in the barn, the one he'd cleaned out after his old mare died. It was sheltered from the wind. It could be made habitable. The word no was on his lips, a fortress wall ready to be razed. But he looked at Eliza's face, at the desperation in her eyes, and he saw a reflection of his own weary soul. They were both just trying to weather the storm. "The old stall in the barn," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "There's a cot in there. It'll have to do." Relief washed over Eliza's face so intensely it was almost painful to watch. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. God bless you." Caleb doubted God had anything to do with it. He felt more cursed than blessed. And so, the fragile dyad of their shared solitude was broken, and a tense, unbalanced triangle was formed. Clara was nothing like her sister, where Eliza was a shadow. Clara was a flame. Even in her grief, there was a vibrant, restless energy about her. She was younger, prettier, with eyes the color of a summer sky and a mouth that, when it wasn't trembling with sorrow, was curved in a way that suggested laughter came easily to it. She moved into the converted stall, a space that smelled of hay and cold leather. Eliza did her best to make it comfortable, bringing a spare blanket and an oil lamp. But it was a stark, lonely space, a constant reminder of Clara's charity case status. The first few days were a study in strained silence. The three of them were like planets held in a precarious orbit by a force they didn't understand. Eliza grew even more withdrawn, her movements quiet and efficient as she went about her chores, her eyes constantly flitting between Caleb's cabin and the barn where her sister slept. Caleb retreated further into himself, his words becoming monosyllabic grunts, his presence a brooding storm cloud on the horizon. It was Clara who refused to abide by the unspoken rules of their grief-stricken world. She talked, She filled the oppressive silence with stories of Cheyenne, with questions about the ranch, with observations about the weather. At first, her voice seemed a jarring intrusion, but slowly, it became a part of the landscape, like the chatter of a magpie or the rustle of the wind. She was not afraid of work. She mucked out the stall without complaint, helped Eliza with the laundry, and even tried her hand at chopping wood, her efforts more enthusiastic than effective. She seemed determined to earn her keep, to prove she was not a burden. The shift happened one evening, a week after her arrival. Caleb came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. He was planning on his usual supper, hardtack soaked in bacon grease, but when he opened the door, he was met not with the familiar scent of wood smoke and solitude, but with the rich aroma of stew. Clara was standing at his hearth, stirring a large pot hanging from the crane. She turned, a wooden spoon in her hand, and offered him a tentative smile. "I hope you don't mind. Eliza said well, she said you don't eat much more than jerky and biscuits. I found some dried vegetables and a bit of salt pork in your stores." Caleb stared at her, then at the bubbling pot. He didn't know what to say. It was the first time a woman had cooked a meal in his house since Sarah. The intimacy of the act was a physical blow. "Eliza is coming over," Clara added quickly, as if sensing his discomfort. "I thought it might be nice for us all to eat a hot meal together." He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her to take her stew and her smile and leave him to his misery. But the aroma was intoxicating, a ghost of a life he thought was lost forever. He simply nodded, pulling off his coat and hanging it by the door. Eliza arrived moments later, a hesitant guest in a space she had never expected to enter. She carried a small, lopsided loaf of bread, her offering to the strange, impromptu feast. They ate at the rough-hewn wooden table in front of the fire. The stew was rich and savory, warming them from the inside out. For a while, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against bowls. But Clara, as always, broke the silence. She asked Caleb about his cattle, about how he knew when a storm was coming, about the names of the constellations in the clear winter sky. He found himself answering, his responses starting as gruff, single words but slowly expanding into short sentences. Eliza sat silently, her hands wrapped around her empty bowl. She watched them. She watched the way the firelight caught the gold in her sister's hair and softened the hard lines of Caleb's face. She saw the way Clara's eyes lit up when she spoke, a spark of her old, vivacious self returning, and she saw the way Caleb looked at Clara. It wasn't a look of desire. Not yet. It was something more dangerous, a look of awakening. He was a man stirring from a long, deep sleep. Clara laughed at something he said, a bright, clear sound that filled the small cabin. Caleb's mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time in 3 years. And, in that moment, watching the two of them bathed in the warm glow of the hearth, Eliza felt a cold dread snake its way around her heart. She had brought the flame to the tinderbox. She had invited the spring thaw into the heart of winter. She gripped her bowl tighter, her knuckles white, and stared into the fire, a silent witness to a beginning she already knew she would regret. The deep, impenetrable silence of a high plains midnight was a state Caleb Thorne had come to know as his natural habitat. It was a silence that amplified the beat of his own heart, the whisper of the wind around the cabin's eaves, and the mournful cry of a distant coyote. Tonight, another sound wormed its way into his restless sleep. It was faint at first, a tiny crack in the immense quiet, but it was undeniably human, a sound of weeping. He lay still for a long moment, his eyes open in the darkness, listening. It wasn't the keening wail of fresh, sharp grief. It was a lower, more broken sound, muffled and choked, the kind of crying a person does when they think no one can hear. It came from the barn, from Clara. A familiar weariness settled over him. He wanted to roll over, to pull the thick wool blanket over his head and retreat back into the numb solace of sleep. It was not his trouble. He had enough ghosts of his own to wrestle with in the dark. But the sound persisted, a small, insistent hook pulling him from his bed. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air of the cabin, he swung his legs to the floor, pulled on his trousers and boots, and shrugged into his heavy sheepskin coat. The cold was a physical shock, stealing his breath as he stepped outside. The snow under his boots squeaked in protest, and a million stars glittered like ice chips in the black velvet sky. The world was vast and indifferent. He made his way to the barn, the lantern in his hand casting a small, dancing circle of light. He found her huddled on the cot in the converted stall, wrapped in a thin blanket, her shoulders shaking. She looked up as his light fell upon her, her face pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and shame. "Mr. Thorne," she stammered, trying to wipe her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." He didn't answer right away. He hung the lantern on a nail and busied himself by checking on the dust devil in the next stall, giving her a moment to compose herself. He ran a hand along the horse's warm flank, drawing a small measure of comfort from the simple, living creature. "It's a cold night for tears," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at her, but stood in the opening of her stall, a large, dark silhouette against the lantern light. Her composure crumbled. The story came pouring out of her, a torrent of humiliation and pain that had been dammed up for weeks. She spoke of the church, filled with flowers and expectant faces. She described her groom, Josiah, standing at the altar, his face a mask of cold righteousness. She recounted his words, spoken loud enough for all to hear, accusing her of being unworthy and impure, of having a wanton spirit that he had mistaken for simple liveliness. He had not just broken their engagement, he had branded her a sinner in front of everyone she had ever known. "He didn't even have the decency to tell me in private," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He wanted to make an example of me, to show everyone what a pious, honorable man he was, casting off the tainted woman, my own mother. She looked at me like I was a stranger, like I had brought this shame upon them." Caleb listened, his expression unreadable. He had seen that brand of piety and redemption. It was a hard, unforgiving thing, a stone used to build walls and break spirits. "He threw me out of the church," Clara continued, her voice gaining a bitter, ragged edge. "The whole town just watched. No one said a word. I walked back to my house, and the door was locked. My father opened it only to give me a small bag and the fare for the stagecoach. He told me to go west, to go to my sister, to not bring any more disgrace to his name." She looked up at him, her beautiful, sky-blue eyes swimming with a desperate, reckless light. "I have nothing, Mr. Thorne. No home, no name, no future. I have nothing left to lose." Caleb felt a stir of something he couldn't name. It wasn't just pity. It was a flicker of recognition. He, too, was a person who had lost everything. He knew what it felt like to be hollowed out, to have the future you'd built your life around turn to ash in an instant. He moved into the stall and sat on an overturned bucket near her cot. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he simply said, "The world is full of cruel men, Miss Clara, and hypocrites who hide behind a prayer book." His quiet solidarity seemed to soothe her more than any platitude could have. The terrible, racking sobs subsided into a shuddering silence. He reached out, his calloused hand hesitantly settling on her shoulder. It was a clumsy, unpracticed gesture, but it was solid and warm. She leaned into the touch, a small, wounded animal seeking shelter. They sat like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the soft snuffling of the horse and the sigh of the wind outside. Unseen, unheard, another soul was standing in the bitter cold. Eliza had been woken by the light of Caleb's lantern moving across the snow. A knot of dread had tightened in her stomach, and she had pulled her shawl around her shoulders and crept to the edge of her property. From the shadows of a snow-laden pine, she had watched him enter the barn, She had heard the low murmur of voices, the heart-wrenching sound of her sister's weeping. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She could see the scene through a crack in the barn wall. Caleb's broad, protective back, Clara's small, shaking form. She saw him sit, saw him place his hand on her sister's shoulder, and a war raged within her. One part of her, the older sister, ached with a fierce, protective love. She wanted to run in, to hold Clara and curse the man who had broken her. But another part of her, the lonely widow, the woman who had only ever received curt necessity from Caleb Thorne, felt a sharp, venomous sting of jealousy. He was giving her sister a comfort he had never offered her. In that small, lamp-lit space, a bond was being forged, a warmth was being shared, and Eliza was on the outside, in the freezing dark. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of displacement, as if she were watching her last, fragile foothold in the world crumble away. She retreated back to her cabin, the cold she felt now having nothing to do with the winter air. The whispers in redemption, already a persistent murmur, grew into a bold and ugly chorus. Caleb Thorne, the grieving recluse, was now Caleb Thorne, the man with 2 women in his keeping. The story twisted and grew with each telling. He was a lonely rancher who had taken advantage of a desperate widow, only to bring her disgraced sister under his roof as well. Tongues clucked with a delicious mixture of pity and condemnation. The talk inevitably reached the ears of Reverend Miller. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to peer directly into the souls of his flock, searching for sin. One afternoon, his bogey appeared at the end of the lane leading to Caleb's ranch. Caleb saw him coming and met him on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his stance a clear barricade. Mr. Thorne, the Reverend began, his voice smooth but firm. I've come as a friend, and as a shepherd to a straying sheep. I'm not one of your flock, Reverend, Caleb said, his voice flat. We are all God's flock, Miller countered, undeterred. And it is my duty to speak when I see a household walking the path of temptation. The town is talking. They speak of the widow Mayhew and her sister, living here, under your roof, without the sanctity of marriage. They have shelter from the cold, Caleb said, his jaw tight. That's all. The world sees more than that, the Reverend pressed. It sees the appearance of sin, the younger one, Miss Clara. I have heard the stories of her disgrace in Cheyenne. It is not proper for a man in your position, a single man, to house such a woman. It invites scandal and temptation, for her soul's salvation, and for your own reputation. I urge you to bring her to the church. We have a room in the back. The women of the congregation will look after her. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He imagined Clara, with her raw pride and broken spirit, subjected to the pious, pitying care of the very women who whispered about her behind their hands. He imagined her living as a charity case, a public spectacle of repentance. She's not a stray dog to be penned up, Reverend, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low growl. She's been hurt enough by righteous folk. She's staying here. The Reverend's face hardened. You are being foolish, Mr. Thorne. You are inviting God's judgment and the condemnation of this community upon your house. Think of what you're doing. I think I'm minding my own business. I suggest you do the same. With that, Caleb turned and went back inside, shutting the door firmly in the preacher's face. The confrontation had consequences. The following week in town, Samuel Blackwood regretfully informed Caleb that he couldn't buy his latest head of cattle. Other ranchers had made it clear they wouldn't do business with a man who associated with a store that supported Caleb. Men who used to nod a greeting now looked straight through him. One night, he found a crude sign nailed to his gatepost, a single word painted in dripping red. Sinners. He tore it down and burned it, the anger in his gut a cold, hard knot. He was being ostracized, but the stubborn, solitary part of him that had long ago turned its back on the world refused to yield. The tension on the ranch became a thick, suffocating blanket. Eliza, hearing of the trouble in town, grew frantic. One afternoon, as a fresh squall of snow began to fall, she confronted her sister in the small, cold cabin they had once shared. "You have to leave, Clara," she said, her voice strained. "You see what's happening. You're ruining him." Clara, who was mending a tear in her dress, looked up, her expression a mixture of hurt and defiance. "Leave? And go where? Should I walk into the snow and wait for the wolves? Is that what you want?" "You can go to the church, like the Reverend offered," Eliza pleaded. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "And be their pet project, their fallen woman to be saved, to spend my days scrubbing floors and my nights listening to them pray for my soul? No, I will not be a spectacle for their charity." "But you're creating a spectacle here!" Eliza's voice rose, cracking with desperation. "They're calling Caleb names. They're trying to ruin his livelihood, all because of you." Clara stood up, her eyes flashing. The vulnerability of the weeping girl in the barn was gone, replaced by a hard, glittering resolve. "Because of me, or because he's the first man to show either of us a shred of human decency? Don't pretend this is just about his reputation. Eliza, this is about you. You're afraid." "Of course I'm afraid." "You're afraid because he looks at me," Clara shot back, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You see him thawing out, and you're terrified he won't be thawing for you." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You may have his quiet respect, sister, but respect doesn't keep the frost from your bones. He has a fire, and I'm freezing." The words struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. She stared at her sister, seeing not the innocent girl she had grown up with, but a woman hardened by humiliation, a survivor willing to do whatever it took to find a scrap of warmth. She had no answer. She simply turned and fled back to her own cabin, the argument unresolved, the poison of it seeping into the frozen ground between them. That night, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled like a hungry beast, rattling the very bones of Caleb's cabin. He lay in his bed, staring into the darkness, his mind a maelstrom. The Reverend's words, the hateful sign, Eliza's worried face, Clara's defiant eyes, it all churned within him. He was a man who had sought peace in emptiness, only to find his world crowded with a conflict he did not want. He was drifting in a restless doze when a faint creak of the floorboards brought him instantly awake. He sat up, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept by his bed. A figure was standing in the doorway of his room, silhouetted against the dying orange glow of the fire in the hearth. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was so cold," she said, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness. She took a step into the room, and another. She was wearing only her thin cotton shift, and she was shivering, her arms wrapped around herself. Every instinct in Caleb's body screamed at him to tell her to go back to the barn, to tell her this was wrong, but he was frozen, caught between the ghost of his dead wife and the living, breathing desperation of the woman in front of him. She came to the side of his bed. "Please, Caleb," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "I can't bear to be alone tonight. Don't make me be alone." In that moment, she was not temptation. She was an echo of his own profound loneliness. He was a drowning man, and she was another soul flailing in the same icy water. Without a word, he moved over, lifting the edge of the heavy blankets. It was a silent, reckless invitation. She slipped in beside him, her body trembling, her skin as cold as ice. The shock of her coldness against his warmth was startling. She turned towards him, her face a pale oval in the gloom, and then they were clinging to each other, a clumsy, frantic collision of two lonely, desperate people. It was a moment of intense, raw need, a hunger for warmth, for contact, for a fleeting second of oblivion. It was brief and confused, a frantic search for something neither of them could name. But as quickly as it began, it shattered. As his hands tangled in her hair, an image of Sarah, his Sarah, smiling at him from across this very bed, flashed in his mind. So vivid it was as if she were standing in the room. A wave of guilt so powerful it was nauseating washed over him. He froze, his body going rigid. He pulled back abruptly, breathing heavily. The moment was broken. The spell shattered. What was he doing? Clara lay still, a profound confusion and a fresh wave of hurt in her eyes. The silence in the room was now heavy and suffocating, filled with shame and regret. Without a word, she slipped out of the bed, pulled her blanket from the floor where she'd dropped it, and vanished back into the main room, the latch of the cabin door clicking softly behind her. Caleb lay awake until dawn. The scent of her on his pillows, the feeling of her cold skin still electric on his. He was consumed by a toxic brew of guilt and a desire he could not deny. Guilt towards the memory of his wife, guilt towards Eliza, the woman to whom he owed a duty of protection, a woman whose trust he had just profoundly betrayed, and beneath it all, an undeniable, shameful pull towards the reckless, wounded girl who had just left his bed. The next day was a silent, agonizing torture. No one spoke of what had happened. Clara kept to the barn, her eyes red-rimmed and averted. Caleb threw himself into his work with a savage intensity, chopping wood until his muscles screamed, his mind a chaotic storm. Eliza, sensing the new, unbearable tension, simply disappeared. She did not come for water. She did not tend her chores. The smoke from her chimney thinned and then died out completely. By late afternoon, a dark premonition began to creep into Caleb's mind. He told himself she was just staying inside, avoiding them. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of blood and violet, the fear became a roaring in his ears. He went to her cabin and knocked. There was no answer. He pushed the door open. The cabin was empty and colder than a tomb. The fire was long dead. A half-finished piece of mending lay on the table. Her shawl was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of his guilt. He ran to the barn. "Clara, where's your sister?" Clara looked up, her face pale with her own dawning horror. "I don't know. I haven't seen her all day." He knew, in that instant. He knew. She had fled. Fled from the suffocating tension, from the unspoken betrayal. Fled into the wilderness, into a landscape that did not forgive such desperate acts. Without another word, he saddled Dust Devil, his movements frantic. He grabbed a heavy blanket and a flask of whiskey. "Stay here. Keep the fire high," he ordered Clara, his voice raw. He rode out into the encroaching twilight, his eyes scanning the endless, unforgiving expanse of white. He called her name until his throat was raw, the sound swallowed by the immense silence. The temperature was dropping fast. He knew he had only hours. The tracks she'd left that morning were already being erased by the wind. He was tracking a ghost. He rode for what felt like an eternity, his fear a living thing clawing at his insides. He thought of finding her, a frozen statue in the snow, and the agony of losing Sarah and Daniel ripped through him anew. He would not lose someone else. He could not. He finally found her, nearly 2 miles from the ranch, curled at the base of a rock outcropping, a small, dark shape almost completely covered by drifting snow. She was unconscious, her face a deathly, waxy white, her lips blue. He leaped from the saddle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt for a pulse. It was there, faint and thready, but it was there. He wrapped her in the heavy blanket, forcing a few drops of whiskey between her frozen lips. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and mounted his horse, holding her tight against his chest, trying to force his own body heat into her. The ride back was a desperate, agonizing prayer. He held her limp form, his mind numb with a single, repeating thought. Live, just live. He burst into his own cabin, kicking the door shut against the night. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Caleb ignored her. He carried Eliza straight to the hearth. laying her on the bearskin rug before the roaring fire. He stripped off her frozen, wet clothes with a clinical urgency, chafing her hands and feet, trying to bring life back to her frozen limbs. He covered her with every blanket he owned. He worked over her for hours, a grim, silent sentinel. Clara hovered nearby, useless and terrified, bringing him hot water and coffee. Finally, a tremor ran through Eliza's body. A low moan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused and confused. Caleb slumped back on his heels, the adrenaline leaving him weak and shaking. She was alive. He looked at her, so fragile and pale by the firelight, and the full weight of his transgression crashed down on him. This was his fault. His moment of weakness, his betrayal, had nearly cost this woman her life. He looked from Eliza's still form to Clara's tear-streaked face, and he knew that the fragile, complicated peace they had found was gone forever, shattered in the winter cold. For 2 days, the cabin was a place of hushed sounds and unspoken words. The world consisted of the crackling fire, the howl of the wind, and Eliza's shallow breathing. Caleb moved with a quiet, relentless focus, a man performing a solemn penance. He brewed broth, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, and sat watch through the long, dark hours, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. Clara was a ghost in the background, fetching water and blankets, her eyes wide and haunted, never speaking unless spoken to. The air was thick with the things they could not say, choked with the guilt of one night and the near tragedy of the next day. On the third morning, Eliza woke fully. Her eyes were clear, the feverish haze gone, replaced by a deep, soul-weary lucidity. She looked at Caleb, who was asleep in the chair beside the hearth, his head slumped on his chest. Then her gaze shifted and found Clara, huddled by the far wall, looking small and broken. Eliza took in the scene, the two of them, trapped in this small, warm room with her, and the full weight of the preceding days settled upon her. Caleb stirred, his senses instantly alert. He saw she was awake and truly with them again. He knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rasp. Eliza's own voice was a dry whisper. "I was a fool." "We were all fools," he countered, his stormy eyes holding hers. He did not look away. He would not hide. "What happened? With me and your sister? It was my fault. I crossed a line that should never have been crossed. There's no excuse for it." He glanced briefly at Clara, who flinched as if struck. His gaze returned to Eliza, unwavering. "But I couldn't leave you out there. When I thought you were gone." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He shook his head, a gesture of profound, helpless finality. "I won't let that happen again. I can't abandon you." It was a confession and a vow, tangled together in a knot of guilt and a fierce, unexpected protectiveness. He had admitted his failing with one sister while declaring his unbreakable duty to the other. He was a man split in two, offering both pieces to her in a gesture of raw, painful honesty. Eliza listened, her heart a dull, aching drum in her chest. She had expected denials, or perhaps a stony silence. This raw admission left her with nowhere to hide. She looked at her sister, whose face was streaked with silent tears, and then back at the man who had both betrayed and saved her, the old Eliza. The timid widow who bowed her head to fate and fled from confrontation had died out there in the snow. The woman who had been carried back was someone else, someone forged in the unforgiving cold. "Running didn't solve anything," she said, her voice gaining a thin, reedy strength. "It almost killed me." She pushed herself up slightly, leaning on her elbows, her gaze clear and hard. "I'm not running again. I am staying." It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration. It hung in the air, changing the dynamic of the room completely. She was no longer a guest or a burden. She was a fixture, a part of this tangled, broken equation, and she would not be moved. Caleb nodded slowly. a flicker of respect in his eyes. Clara just wept, her shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed to have no end. In the weeks that followed, a fragile, deeply uncomfortable truce settled over the ranch. Eliza moved back to her own cabin, but the separation was merely physical. Their lives were now irrevocably intertwined. She came to Caleb's cabin to cook and share meals, a silent insistence on a shared existence. They were a strange, tense trio, orbiting each other with a wary gravity. The silence was a constant presence, broken only by necessary questions and polite, empty phrases. The memory of that one night was a chasm between them, a place where words went to die. Eliza grew stronger, both in body and spirit. The near-death experience had stripped away her layers of fear and deference. She met the judgmental stares in town with a cool indifference that seemed to unnerve people more than her previous timidity ever had. She was no longer just the pitiful widow. She was the widow who had survived the blizzard, the woman who lived on the disgraced ranch and did not seem to care what anyone thought. A hard shell was forming around her, and she clung to it like armor. Caleb watched her transformation with a quiet awe. He saw the new steel in her spine, the directness in her gaze. His guilt towards her was a constant, dull ache, a debt he felt he could never repay. His feelings for Clara were a different kind of torture. He was bound to her by a shared mistake, a moment of weakness that had changed everything. He felt a frustrating, angry sense of responsibility for her. Yet the memory of her in his arms was a spark of heat he couldn't quite extinguish. He was a man caught in a crossfire of his own making. The first signs of spring came, a slow, grudging thaw that turned the snow to slush and the frozen earth to mud. The creek began to flow again, and the first green shoots of grass appeared on the sunny side of the hills. But inside the two cabins, the winter held fast. The tension finally snapped. As it was always bound to do, it started quietly. Clara, who had been pale and listless for weeks, began to suffer from bouts of morning sickness. At first, she hid it, slipping out of the cabin at dawn. But one morning, she couldn't make it outside in time, and the violent, retching sounds from behind the cabin brought Eliza running. She found her sister leaning against the rough log wall, pale and trembling, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the terrible, unspoken truth passed between them. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a catastrophic certainty. Eliza's carefully constructed armor shattered. The blood drained from her face. "No," she whispered, the word a plea, a denial, a lament. Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears, a look of sheer terror on her face. "Eliza, But Eliza didn't wait to hear it. She turned and walked away, her step stiff and robotic, back to her own cabin. She shut the door, leaned against it, and slid to the floor, the world tilting beneath her. The betrayal was no longer a memory or a suspicion. It was a living, growing thing. A seed planted in a moment of weakness was taking root, and its fruit would be a lifetime of shame. The shock was a physical blow, leaving all three of them reeling. Caleb, seeing the sickness and the look on Eliza's face, knew at once the final, damning consequence of his actions had arrived. He felt like a man standing on a precipice, the ground crumbling away at his feet. Clara locked herself in the barn, refusing to eat, consumed by a fear so profound it was paralyzing. Eliza stayed in her cabin, lost in a storm of grief and rage. For 2 days, they remained in their separate prisons of misery. On the second night, Eliza, unable to bear the silence any longer, lit a lantern and walked to the barn. She found Clara lying on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her face hollowed out by fear. Eliza sat on the overturned bucket, the same one Caleb had sat on weeks before. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I hate you for this," Eliza said finally, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. The words hung in the cold air, brutal and honest. Clara flinched, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I know. I hate him," Eliza continued, her voice gaining a slight tremor. "And I hate myself for not being able to leave this place." Another long silence. Then, a broken sob escaped Clara's lips. "I never wanted to hurt you, Eliza. You're the only person in the world who has ever been truly kind to me." "Then why?" Eliza asked, the question raw and ragged. "Why would you do it?" "I don't know," Clara cried, sitting up, her face crumpling. "I was so lost, so ashamed and cold and lonely, and he was there. He was quiet and strong, and he didn't look at me with pity. For a minute, just for 1 minute, I felt like I wasn't the ruined girl from the church. I just wanted a little warmth." Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper as she looked at her sister, her eyes pleading for an understanding she didn't deserve. "Why did it have to be him? Why was he the only one I wanted?" The raw, desperate honesty of the question pierced through Eliza's anger. She saw the terrified girl beneath the woman who had betrayed her. She saw her own loneliness reflected in her sister's desperate act. The hate, so hot and sharp moments before, dissolved into a vast, aching sorrow. She moved to the cot and pulled her sister into her arms. They clung to each other, two broken halves of the same whole, and wept. They cried for the men who had hurt them, for the families who had abandoned them, for the choices that had led them to this impossible, desolate place. They cried until there were no tears left, only the shuddering exhaustion of a shared and bottomless grief. The next day, Caleb found them together in his cabin. They were sitting at the table, their faces pale and swollen. But a silent accord had been reached between them. It was time for him to face them. He stood before them, his hat in his hands, a man stripped of all his defenses. "I am sorry," he began, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. "What I did to both of you, to this house, it was a greater sin than any the preacher could name. I have no right to ask for forgiveness." Eliza and Clara just looked at him, their expressions unreadable. He took a deep breath, the confession he had been wrestling with for weeks finally rising to the surface. "When my wife, Sarah, was alive, I loved her. I truly did. But it was a quiet love, calm, like a river in the summertime. It was steady and gentle, and I thought that was all love was meant to be." He looked from Eliza's steady, wounded gaze to Clara's tear-filled eyes. "I had buried that man. I had buried everything. And then you came." His voice grew thick with a raw, confusing emotion. You are not a quiet river. You are a wildfire. You are a blizzard. You fill this empty place with so much life and pain and anger and need. You've woken something in me I thought was dead and buried. You make me burn." He shook his head, looking down at his worn boots. "It's no excuse. It's just the truth. I am sorry for the ashes, for all the things that have been burned down because of me." His words hung in the room, a shocking, painful, and brutally honest declaration. He hadn't excused his actions, but he had laid the truth of his heart bare before them. He loved his wife's memory, but these two living, breathing, complicated women had brought him back to a life of violent, searing feeling, and he didn't know how to navigate it without causing destruction. As spring finally took hold of the land, their isolation became absolute. The town of Redemption celebrated its annual spring festival, a day of picnics and dances to welcome the new season. But for the 3 inhabitants of the Thorn Ranch, there was no celebration. They were a pariah state of 3, watching the distant sounds of laughter and music drift on the wind, a painful reminder of the world from which they were exiled. They fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the steady growth of the child in Clara's womb. Eliza, with a grim pragmatism, took charge. She had seen births before. She knew what was needed. Caleb worked relentlessly, expanding his garden, hunting for extra meat, stockpiling supplies. His every action was geared towards protecting the fragile, scandalous new life he had helped create. They rarely spoke of their feelings, but their actions became a language of their own, a language of shared responsibility and grim determination. The baby was due in the early summer. As the time drew near, the atmosphere on the ranch grew heavy with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The condemnation of the town had not lessened. It had festered. Reverend Miller had continued to preach against the den of iniquity on the edge of his parish, stoking the fires of self-righteousness and fear. The breaking point came on a hot, breathless evening in June. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distant mountains. Caleb was on the porch, oiling a harness, while the sisters sat inside, sewing by the light of a lantern. A flicker of unnatural orange light at the end of the lane caught his eye. He stood up slowly, his body going rigid. It wasn't a lantern. It was torches, a dozen of them, bobbing in the darkness, coming closer. He stepped back inside, his face grim. "Stay in here and bar the door." The women looked up, their face etched with fear. They could hear it now, the tramp of boots, the low, angry murmur of men's voices. Caleb took his rifle from the rack above the fireplace. He checked the load, his movements economical and sure. He walked back to the door and stepped out onto the porch, standing squarely in the center, the rifle held loosely at his side. The mob stopped just beyond the weak circle of light cast from the cabin's windows. There were about 15 of them, local ranchers and farmhands, their faces twisted with drink and righteous fury. At the front stood Jedediah Stone, a hard-nosed cattleman who considered himself the town's moral authority. Reverend Miller was not with them, but his words were the invisible banner they marched under. "Thorn!" Stone shouted, his voice slurring slightly. "We've come to cleanse this land of your filth." "This is my land, Jedediah," Caleb said, his voice dangerously calm. "You're trespassing." "Your land is a blight on this community," another man yelled. "Harboring a harlot and her scheming sister. We won't stand for it. Send them out. We'll see they get a ride on the first cart out of the county." "You're not touching them," Caleb said. Stone took a menacing step forward, brandishing his torch. "We are God-fearing men. Thorn! We won't have whores and bastards on our doorstep. Send out the disgraced girl and the widow who enables her, or we'll burn this place to the ground and drag them out ourselves." From inside, Caleb heard a sharp cry of fear from Clara. He stood his ground, a lone figure against a tide of hatred. He knew he could perhaps pick off one or two of them before they overwhelmed him, but it would be a bloodbath, and the women would be left to their mercy. Violence was not the answer. The truth, however insane, was his only weapon. He raised his head, his voice ringing out in the charged silence, clear and steady and utterly defiant. He looked Jedediah Stone square in the eye. "She is my wife," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the mob. Every man froze, stunned into silence. Caleb's gaze was like granite. He pointed with his chin towards the cabin door, behind which Eliza was surely listening, her heart frozen in her chest. Then he took a breath and delivered the final, world-altering blow. "And her sister," he declared, his voice rising to carry over the whisper of the wind, "is about to be the mother of my child." For a long, heart-stopping moment, Caleb's words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. The mob, fueled by whiskey and righteousness, was struck dumb. Wife, child. The concepts were so contrary to the simple, sordid narrative they had constructed that their collective mind could not immediately process them. They stared at Caleb, then at the dark, silent cabin behind him, their certainty wavering. Jedediah Stone was the first to recover, his confusion quickly souring back into rage. "Liar!" he bellowed, his face purpling. "You're a blasphemer as well as a sinner. You think you can protect your whores with a lie?" "It's no lie." Caleb's voice was like iron. "Now get off my land." But the spell was broken. The men, their courage bolstered by Stone's outrage, began to surge forward. One man, emboldened by the back of the crowd, foolishly hurled his torch. It wasn't aimed well. It sailed over Caleb's head, a fiery arc in the night, and landed not on the cabin's roof, but squarely in the open loft of the barn, where the summer's hay was stored, dry as tinder. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A whoosh of orange flame erupted, licking up the dry timbers with an insatiable hunger. Within seconds, the entire loft was an inferno. The men in the mob, who had come for a righteous confrontation, froze in horror. This was not what they had intended. The fire was a wild, terrifying beast, and their petty grievances seemed insignificant in the face of its fury. The chaos broke the mob's spell. Men who had been shouting for justice a moment before now shouted in alarm. They backed away, their torches suddenly looking like children's toys against the raging bonfire of the barn. Their righteous crusade had devolved into a potential disaster that could consume the entire ranch, and no one wanted the blame for that. They began to scatter, melting back into the darkness from which they had come, leaving Jedediah Stone standing alone for a moment, his face illuminated by the roaring flames, before he too turned and fled. Inside the cabin, the sudden, terrifying bloom of light and the roar of the fire was a shock that jolted the world off its axis. Clara screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. She scrambled to the window, her eyes wide with panic as she saw the barn, her first miserable shelter on this ranch, being devoured by flames. And then, a different kind of fire ignited within her. A sharp, searing pain shot through her lower back, so intense it stole her breath. She gasped, her hands flying to her swollen belly, which had gone rigid as a drum. Another wave of pain followed, harder this time, buckling her knees. "Eliza!" she cried out, her voice a strangled gasp. "Eliza, the baby! It's coming!" Eliza, who had been frozen in place since hearing Caleb's impossible declaration, was snapped out of her stupor by her sister's cry. She rushed to Clara's side, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of desperate, protective instinct. "Now?" she breathed, her mind racing. "It can't be now." But the baby cared nothing for convenience. Clara cried out again, a low, guttural moan, as another contraction seized her. The terror of the fire, the shock of the mob, had thrown her body into a panic, and it was now in a desperate, frantic hurry to bring this child into the world. Outside, Caleb was in a battle of his own. The fire was a living monster, spitting embers that the wind carried like deadly seeds toward the cabin. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, grabbing buckets of water from the rain barrel and dousing the cabin walls, his face grim, his mind a maelstrom. The barn was lost, he knew that. His tools, his stores, the structure itself, all of it was being turned to ash. But he would not lose the house. He would not lose them. The primal sounds of his sister's labor cut through Eliza's fear and resentment, leaving only a raw, terrifying clarity. She was the only one who could help. All the whispered advice from the women in Cheyenne, all the scraps of knowledge she'd gleaned from her mother, it all came rushing back to her. She guided Clara to the cot in the corner of the room, her voice a soothing murmur she didn't know she possessed. "Breathe, Clara. Just breathe with me. We can do this." The world shrank to the small, lamp-lit space of the cabin. Outside, the fire raged, casting dancing, demonic shadows on the walls. Inside, the elemental, agonizing miracle of birth was underway. Eliza was terrified. Her hands shook as she wiped Clara's brow with a cool cloth. She was delivering the physical proof of her own heartbreak. This child was the consequence of a profound betrayal, a constant, living reminder of what had happened between her sister and Caleb. But as she looked at Clara's face, contorted with pain and fear, the resentment dissolved. This was her little sister, her blood, the girl she had once played with in sun-drenched meadows, and the life that was struggling to be born was innocent of all their sins. It was just a baby, coming into a world of fire and chaos. A deep, aching wave of love and pity washed over Eliza, so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She worked tirelessly, her initial panic solidifying into a grim resolve. She was a woman who had held her own stillborn son, a cold, perfect, silent tragedy. She would not lose this child. She would not let this night end in any more loss. Her own grief became a source of strength, her own pain a well of empathy. She murmured encouragement, held Clara's hand in a vice-like grip, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Caleb, having done all he could to protect the cabin from the embers, finally abandoned the fight against the barn and stumbled inside, his face black with soot, his eyes wild. The scene that met him stopped him in his tracks. Eliza was kneeling on the floor beside the cot, her sleeves rolled up, her face a mask of intense concentration. Clara was on the bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her knuckles white as she gripped the bedding. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and fear and the raw, metallic smell of birth. He was a man who had faced down blizzards, bears, and mobs, but this elemental, female power terrified and humbled him. He felt like an intruder, a useless, clumsy oaf in this sacred, painful space. "Caleb," Eliza said, her voice sharp, not looking up. "Water, and more clean cloths." He moved to obey, his actions automatic. He was no longer the master of this house, the protector. He was a foot soldier taking orders from a general in the midst of a desperate battle. The final moments were a blur of firelight and shadow, pain and prayer. Eliza, her face slick with a mixture of sweat and tears, guided her sister through the final, agonizing push. "Now, Clara, now! I can see the head!" Caleb dropped to his knees on the other side of the cot, taking Clara's free hand in his own. He didn't know what to say, what to do, so he just held on, pouring all his strength, his hope, his desperate plea for redemption into that simple touch. And then, with a final, heart-rending cry from Clara and a soft, wet slither, the baby was born. It lay in Eliza's trembling hands, a small, perfect, red-faced creature, slick and silent for a terrifying second before its mouth opened and it let out a thin, reedy wail that cut through the roar of the dying fire outside. A boy. In that instant, the world stood still. The fire outside cast a final, great pulse of orange light through the window. It illuminated the scene in a single, unforgettable tableau. Clara collapsed back on the pillows, exhausted and weeping with relief. Caleb, still kneeling, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief, staring at his son, and Eliza, holding the newborn child, her face drenched with tears. The firelight catching the tracks on her cheeks as she looked down at the tiny, squirming life that had just irrevocably bound the three of them together forever. News of that night traveled on the wind, carried by the men from the mob who spoke in hushed, ashamed tones of the fire and Caleb Thorne's shocking declaration. The story of the baby born in the midst of the flames became a piece of local legend, a dark, unsettling fairy tale. The town of Redemption responded with a profound and judgmental silence. They offered no help, no congratulations. The pariahs of the Thorne Ranch were left to their own devices. But the world was larger than one small, self-righteous town. A week after the birth, a woman appeared at the ranch. She was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands gnarled but steady. She introduced herself as Martha, a midwife from a small settlement over the ridge. She said she'd heard of a baby born in difficult circumstances and thought they might need a hand. She entered the cabin, took one look at the exhausted sisters and the helpless man, and simply took charge. She bathed the baby, showed Clara how to nurse, and brewed a restorative tea for Eliza. She spoke in a calm, no-nonsense tone that brooked no argument. Her presence was a balm, a quiet anchor in the chaotic aftermath of the birth. She never asked about the circumstances. She never mentioned the fire or the whispers. She saw only a new mother who needed help and a baby who needed care. She had planned to stay a day or two. She ended up staying for 3 weeks, and when she left, a quiet understanding and a deep well of gratitude remained in her wake. Life on the ranch settled into a new, strange, and demanding rhythm. The burned-out shell of the barn was a constant, stark reminder of the night the baby, whom Clara named Samuel, was born. With the help gone and their isolation complete, the three of them had to rely solely on each other. Caleb began to build with a grim determination. He started clearing the debris from the barn and salvaging what timber he could. Then, he began to lay the foundation for a new room, an addition to the main cabin. It was slow, back-breaking work, but it was a tangible act of creation, a defiant statement against the forces that had tried to tear them down. He was not just building a room. He was building a home large enough to hold his impossible family. Their shunning by the community was near total, but it was not absolute. Occasionally, they would find small offerings left on a distant fence post, a sack of flour, a basket of late summer squash, a jar of precious honey. These were anonymous gifts, left by neighbors whose Christian charity outweighed their fear of condemnation. They never knew who to thank, but the small acts of kindness were a reminder that even in the harshest judgment, a flicker of humanity could survive. They divided the labor of their lives. Clara, consumed by the fierce, protective love of a new mother, devoted herself entirely to baby Samuel. The child became her world, her purpose, her redemption. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown, hunting, farming, and building, his silent labor a constant provision for their needs. And Eliza, ever the pragmatist, found a way to bridge the gap with the town that had rejected them. She sent word via a passing freight driver that she was taking in sewing and mending. Soon, small bundles of torn shirts and dresses began to appear at the end of their lane. Left with a few coins for payment, it was a transaction. Not a friendship, but it was a connection. A way to earn the small amount of cash they needed for salt, sugar, and coffee. She worked late into the nights, her needle a small, flashing weapon against their poverty. One night, long after Clara and the baby had fallen asleep in the main room, Caleb found Eliza sitting on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted sky. He sat down on the steps near her, the silence between them comfortable for the first time in a long while. "He looks like you," she said quietly, her gaze still on the heavens. Caleb knew she meant the baby. He just nodded. He has his mother's eyes, though. They sat for another minute, the crickets chirping a peaceful chorus. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm not a man who has the right words for things. I know what I've done. I know the position I've put you in. I'm not worthy of your kindness or your help, or your presence in this house." He paused, turning to look at her, his face earnest and shadowed in the moonlight. "But I have to tell you the truth. I can't live without you both." The words were a quiet earthquake, shaking the very foundations of her resolve. It wasn't a declaration of romantic love, but something deeper, more elemental. It was an admission of need, a confession of an unbreakable, unconventional bond. She felt a tremor run through her. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hesitantly covering her own where it rested on the porch step. His touch was warm and solid. Every instinct she had screamed at her to pull away, to protect the last, untouched corner of her heart. But she didn't. She sat there, trembling slightly, and let his hand rest on hers. It was a silent, profound acceptance. The next evening, for the first time since the baby was born, the three of them sat down to supper together, not as a tense collection of individuals, but as a family. The meal was simple. Venison stew and the bread Eliza had baked, but the atmosphere was transformed. The oppressive weight of unspoken things had lifted, replaced by a quiet, fragile peace. Clara rocked Samuel's cradle with her foot, a soft smile on her face. Caleb ate with a steady, unhurried calm, and Eliza felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stew. After the meal, As the women were clearing the table, Caleb reached into his pocket. He placed two small objects on the rough-hewn wood. They were rings, crudely but lovingly carved from the dark, rich wood of a fallen juniper tree. They were not polished or perfect, but they were solid and real. Eliza and Clara stared at them, then at him, their expressions questioning. Caleb looked at each of them in turn, his gaze clear and solemn. "It's not the law," he said, his voice steady and sure. "And it's not the church." He gently pushed one ring towards Eliza and the other towards Clara. "But it is my oath, to both of you, and to the boy, to provide, to protect, to never run. This is my vow." The wooden rings were a silent, constant presence. They were not worn. Not yet. They sat on the rough mantelpiece above the hearth. Two simple, dark circles against the stone. They were not a promise of a future that mirrored the outside world, but a testament to the strange, unshakable reality they had built within the walls of the cabin. An oath made of wood and wilderness, witnessed only by the three people who understood its meaning. Autumn came to the high plains, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in strokes of brilliant gold and turning the vast sky to a crisp, piercing blue. A fragile peace settled over the Thorn Ranch, the peace of survivors who had weathered the battle and were now tending to their wounds and rebuilding their fortress. Life fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of a growing child. Caleb worked with a relentless, focused energy. The new room he was building onto the cabin rose log by steady log, a physical manifestation of his vow. It was an act of permanence, of making space, of declaring to the world that this unorthodox family was not a temporary arrangement. He was a man carving a new world out of the wilderness with his bare hands, and the act seemed to settle a long-standing storm within him. Clara had been reborn in the fire of childbirth. The reckless, wounded girl had been burned away, leaving a woman of fierce, quiet strength. Her son, Samuel, was the sun around which her universe now turned. She moved with a newfound purpose, her days filled with the small, essential tasks of motherhood. The love she poured into the child was a healing balm, slowly mending the broken pieces of her own heart. She rarely spoke of the past, of Cheyenne, of the man who had tried to destroy her. Her gaze was fixed on the small, perfect face of her son. Eliza became the quiet, steady hub around which they all turned. She managed the household with a grim efficiency, her sewing providing the few dollars they needed for necessities. She was the one who kept the larder full, who mended the clothes, who brewed the coffee in the pre-dawn dark. She had found a different kind of strength, not the fierce, protective fire of her sister, but the deep, resilient strength of a river that wears away stone over time. She watched Caleb and Clara. She watched the baby, and she held the fragile threads of their life together in her steady hands. The tension between the three of them had not vanished, but it had transformed. The sharp edges of guilt, betrayal, and jealousy had been worn smooth by shared hardship and the overwhelming, unifying presence of the baby. They were a strange constellation, held together by a gravity they didn't try to name. They were simply a family. Their isolation was a given. When Caleb or Eliza had to ride into Redemption for supplies, they were met with a wall of cold silence or averted eyes. They were an uncomfortable truth the town did not want to acknowledge. They were a living, breathing challenge to the rigid rules of church and society. And for that, they remained unforgiven. The disruption came, as it always did, from the east. A large wagon train, the last of the season before the snows, rumbled through the pass, a long, dusty serpent bringing new faces, new goods, and old ghosts to the west. It camped for 2 nights by the creek that bordered Caleb's land, a noisy, bustling intrusion into their quiet world. On the second afternoon, a man detached himself from the camp and walked toward the cabin. He was dressed in a fine black wool coat and a polished hat, looking utterly out of place against the raw, untamed landscape. Clara was outside, hanging baby clothes on a line strung between two pines, with Samuel sleeping in a basket at her feet. She didn't see the man until he was only a few yards away. When she looked up, the blood drained from her face. Her breath caught in her throat, and the clothespin she was holding fell from her nerveless fingers. It was Josiah. He had aged in the past year. There were new lines of strain around his mouth, and his eyes, once so full of cold righteousness, now held a flicker of something else. Anxiety, perhaps, or desperation. He stopped a respectful distance away, removing his hat in a gesture that was meant to be gentlemanly but felt profoundly false. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I have been searching for you for months." Clara couldn't speak. Her mind was a whirlwind of shock and a sudden, sickening dread. This was a specter from a life she had buried, a life of shame and humiliation. Seeing him here, on this land that had become her sanctuary, felt like a violation. "I was wrong," he continued, taking a step closer. "I was a fool. I allowed pride and the foolish gossip of others to cloud my judgment. I have sinned against you and against God. I have come to make amends." His words were a well-rehearsed speech, but they held no warmth, no genuine remorse. He spoke of his own sin, his own pride, his own need for absolution. It was all about him. Clara found her voice, a harsh whisper. "What do you want, Josiah?" "I want to do the honorable thing," he said, his gaze pious. "I want to restore your good name, my life in Cheyenne. It has not been easy. The scandal, it seems, tainted me as well. People talk. My business has suffered. It is clear that God means for us to rectify this." He took another step, his eyes falling on the basket at her feet. A flicker of distaste crossed his face as he saw the sleeping baby. He quickly looked away. "I have come to ask you again. Clara, I have come to ask you to be my wife." The proposal, which a year ago would have been the culmination of all her dreams, now landed with the sickening thud of an insult. He wasn't offering love or forgiveness. He was offering a business transaction, a way to repair his own damaged reputation. He wanted to marry the woman he had publicly branded as impure, to erase his own mistake and quiet the gossip. She stared at him, at his fine coat and his smooth words, and saw him for what he was, a hollow man, a cage of piety and pride. He hadn't even acknowledged the child, the living, breathing consequence of the life she had been forced into after he had cast her out. "You called me a disgrace," she said, her voice trembling with a cold, rising anger. "You shamed me in front of God and everyone I knew. You let my own family throw me out like trash. And now you come here, talking of honor." "It is the Christian thing to do," he insisted, a hint of his old arrogance creeping into his tone. "To forgive, to raise you up from your fallen state. I am offering you a respectable life. Clara, a home, a name for the child." He still wouldn't look at Samuel. The confrontation was interrupted by the crunch of boots on gravel. Caleb had come around the side of the new construction, a hammer in his hand. He took in the scene at a glance, the fancy stranger, Clara's pale, stricken face, and his expression hardened into a thundercloud. Eliza appeared in the doorway of the cabin, a silent, watchful presence. "This is private property," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He didn't raise it, but it carried a weight that made Josiah take an involuntary step back. "I am speaking with my betrothed," Josiah said, puffing out his chest. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "She is no one's betrothed. She is a free woman, on my land. State your business and be on your way." "My business is to offer this woman my hand in marriage and save her from this squalor," Josiah said, gesturing with contempt at the unfinished cabin, the laundry line, the raw, untamed wilderness around them. Clara felt something snap inside her. This man, who had sentenced her to this life, was now judging it. Before Caleb could respond, she stepped forward, placing herself between the two men. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. Josiah stared at her. "No? Clara, be reasonable. What future do you have here? With this man, in this God-forsaken place?" "I have a future," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I have a home, and I have a son." Caleb and Eliza remained silent, witnesses to her battle. This was her decision to make, her ghost to exorcise. Caleb's hand tightened on his hammer, but he held his ground. Eliza's hands were clasped at her waist, her knuckles white. They were giving her the space to choose, the freedom that no one, not her father, not Josiah, had ever granted her before. "Think of what you are throwing away," Josiah pleaded, his composure finally cracking, revealing the desperate self-interest beneath. "Your reputation, a place in society, a proper father for your boy." Clara turned and walked to the basket. She gently lifted her sleeping son into her arms, holding him close to her chest. She looked from Samuel's peaceful face to Josiah's strained, desperate one. The choice was so clear it was almost laughable. It was the choice between a life of cold, hollow pretense and a life of difficult, complicated, but profoundly real love. She turned back to Josiah, her eyes clear and free of all doubt. She hugged her son tighter. "My family," she said, her voice ringing with a final, unshakable certainty, "is not back there anymore. It is here." Josiah stared at her, at the baby in her arms, at the grim-faced rancher and the silent woman in the doorway. He saw a wall he could not breach, a world he could not comprehend. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked back toward the wagon train, a man defeated by a strength he could not recognize. That night, a new and terrible fire came to redemption. It started in the livery stable. A lantern kicked over in the hay. A strong, dry wind fanned the flames. And within an hour, the entire center of the small town was a raging inferno. The volunteer fire bell rang frantically, a sound of pure panic that carried all the way to the ranch. Caleb saw the glow against the sky and didn't hesitate. He saddled Dust Devil, his face set in grim lines. "Bar the door behind me," he said to the women. "Don't open it for anyone." He was a pariah, but those were people in trouble. Men, women, children. His own history with them didn't matter. When he reached the town, it was a scene from hell. The general store, the saloon, and 2 houses were engulfed in flames. Men shouted, women screamed, and horses panicked in the street. The bucket brigade was a futile effort against the roaring blaze. Caleb tethered his horse and joined the line without a word. He worked alongside the very men who had scorned him, their faces black with soot, their eyes wide with fear. In the face of the fire, old grudges were burned away, leaving only the raw, desperate need to survive. A woman's shriek cut through the roar. "My baby! My son is still in there!" It was Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, her house now a blazing pyre. She was trying to run back inside, but 2 men were holding her back. "The upstairs room!" she sobbed. Before anyone could stop him, Caleb grabbed a wet blanket from a trough, wrapped it around his head and shoulders, and charged into the burning building. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking, blinding poison. He took the stairs 2 at a time, the wood groaning under his weight. He kicked open the bedroom door and found the small child, no more than 3 years old, huddled under a bed, crying in terror. He scooped the boy into his arms, wrapped him in the blanket, and turned to go back. But the stairs he had just climbed were now a sheet of flame. The way was cut off. Thinking fast, he ran to the window, smashed it open with his elbow, and looked down. 2 men, seeing his plight, had dragged a wagon full of hay beneath the window. "Drop him!" one of them yelled. Caleb held the child out, let him go, and watched as he landed safely in the hay. Then, with a prayer on his lips, he leaped. He landed hard. The wind knocked out of him, but he was alive. He had saved the child. The news of his heroism spread through the town even faster than the fire had. Caleb Thorne, the sinner, the outcast, had risked his life to save the son of one of his harshest critics. When he walked through the town the following week, the averted eyes were gone. Men who had once ignored him now nodded, a grudging respect in their gaze. Samuel Blackwood, the store owner, offered him credit for supplies to rebuild his barn. The wall of silence had been breached, not by words, but by a single, selfless act of courage. A week later, another visitor came to the ranch. It was Reverend Miller. He came alone, his face old and weary. Caleb met him on the porch, his expression wary. The Reverend didn't offer apologies or speeches. He simply looked past Caleb, into the yard, where a strange and peaceful scene was unfolding. Eliza and Clara were on their knees in the newly expanded garden, working side by side, weeding a patch of late-season beans. Baby Samuel was gurgling happily on a blanket in the shade. It was a picture of quiet, domestic harmony, a world away from the den of iniquity the Reverend had once preached about. He watched them for a long, silent minute, his gaze thoughtful. Then he turned back to Caleb. He looked him in the eye, a flicker of something new, humility, perhaps, in his expression. "God," the Reverend said quietly, his voice raspy, "does not need to understand a reason to show mercy." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Caleb standing on the porch, stunned by the unexpected benediction. That night, a profound peace settled over the cabin. The ghosts of the past, Josiah, the mob, the town's judgment, had all been faced and, in their own way, vanquished. After Clara and the baby were asleep, Caleb found Eliza sitting by the hearth, the two wooden rings in her hands, her expression soft and contemplative in the firelight. He sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The air between them was no longer filled with tension or guilt, but with a deep, unspoken understanding. They had been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and had come out the other side, forged into something new. He reached out and gently took one of the rings from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and this time, she did not tremble. She did not pull away. He looked into her eyes, and in their quiet depths, he saw not the timid widow he had first met, but a woman of incredible strength and grace, a woman who had saved him as surely as he had saved her from the snow. Slowly, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic, desperate need like the one he had shared with her sister. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was quiet and deep, and filled with the profound relief of a long and difficult journey finally reaching its end. It was a kiss of salvation and harmony, a silent vow that tasted of wood smoke and hope. In that moment, a bond that had been forged in duty and sealed in crisis was finally consecrated in a love that was as steady and sure as the earth beneath them. Later, as Eliza slept peacefully in Caleb's bed for the first time, her hand tucked in his, he heard a soft footstep in the main room. He slipped out of bed and saw Clara standing by the dying embers of the fire, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had seen them. He knew it instantly. She looked at him, and there was no anger in her eyes, no jealousy. There was only a quiet, sad understanding, and a flicker of her own deep-seated need. She didn't reproach him. She didn't question. She simply looked at him, the man who was the father of her child, her protector, the center of her strange new family. And her voice was a soft whisper in the darkness. "Don't forget," she said, her gaze holding his, "that I need you, too." The seasons turn on the high plains with a slow, deliberate, and undeniable power. They are a force that cannot be argued with or hurried. Winter yields to a muddy, tentative spring. Spring bursts into a summer of long, sun-scorched days. Summer mellows into an autumn of gold and aching beauty. A year passed on the Thorne Ranch, marked not by a calendar, but by the turning of the earth and the steady, quiet rhythm of their lives. The raw, unfinished room Caleb had begun in the wake of the fire was now complete, its logs sealed tight against the wind, its window looking out over the valley. The burned-out skeleton of the barn had been cleared, and a new, smaller but sturdier structure was rising in its place, a testament to Caleb's relentless labor. But the most surprising change was the garden, beside the cabin. In a patch of earth that had once grown only stubborn sagebrush, now grew a riot of defiant color, hollyhocks and zinnias standing tall against the harsh landscape, their bright, cheerful faces a stark contrast to the muted tones of the prairie. It was a patch of impossible beauty, tended by the hands of two sisters who had decided that survival was not enough. They would also have life. Inside the expanded cabin, the changes were even more profound. The space was no longer just a shelter, but a home. It was filled with the sounds of a growing child. Samuel was no longer a helpless infant, but a sturdy, curious toddler with his mother's sky-blue eyes and a tumble of dark hair that hinted at his father. He was the sun around which their strange planet turned, his gurgling laughter the music that filled the silences, his small, grasping hands the force that held them all together. The wall of condemnation from the town of redemption had not so much crumbled as it had weathered away. The fire had burned away the worst of the town's self-righteousness, leaving behind a grudging respect and a deep, unsettling curiosity. The townsfolk had seen Caleb Thorne, the sinner, run into a burning building for another man's child. They had heard the story of the baby born in the midst of the flames. Their simple narrative of sin and damnation could no longer contain the complexities of the truth. Now, when Caleb or Eliza rode into town, the cold shoulders and averted eyes were mostly gone. They were replaced by hesitant nods, quiet greetings. Men who had once been part of the mob now discussed the price of cattle with Caleb, their tones respectful. Women who had whispered behind their hands now offered Eliza a tight, shy smile. Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, always had a piece of hard candy for young Samuel, a small, sweet offering of gratitude that was a treaty in itself. They were still outsiders, their family a puzzle the town couldn't solve, but they were no longer pariahs. They had become a part of the landscape, a local legend, a cautionary tale that had somehow, inexplicably, turned into a story of survival. They were viewed with a mixture of sympathy, awe, and a profound, unsettling admiration. One warm afternoon in late summer, a woman walked the long, dusty lane to the ranch. It was Abigail Albright, the town's unmarried schoolteacher, a quiet, lonely woman who had always lived on the fringes of society herself. She found Eliza on the porch, a basket of mending at her side, her needle flashing in the sunlight. Miss Albright hesitated at the bottom of the steps, clutching a small bundle in her hands. Mrs. Mrs. Thorne, she stammered, unsure of the proper address. Eliza is fine, Eliza said, her voice calm and even. She offered the woman a small, welcoming smile. Please, sit. Abigail perched nervously on the edge of the steps. I heard you do the finest sewing in the county, she said, unfurling her bundle to reveal a dress with a torn seam. I was wondering, if you weren't too busy, if you might show me how to do this stitch. I'm not very skilled with a needle. It was a pretense, and they both knew it. This was an embassy, a mission of curiosity from the world beyond their ranch. For an hour, Eliza patiently guided the schoolteacher's clumsy fingers, the two of them speaking of neutral things, the weather, the price of thread, the coming of autumn. Samuel toddled out onto the porch, chasing a butterfly, and Miss Albright watched him with a soft, wistful expression. Finally, as the lesson was ending, the teacher gathered her courage and asked the question that she had really come all this way to ask. She looked at Eliza, at her calm face and her capable hands, at the peaceful, domestic scene around them. Are you happy? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was so direct, so intimate. It took Eliza's breath away. She stopped her sewing and looked out at the vast, empty expanse of the plains. the land that had almost claimed her. She thought of the long, lonely winter, of the fire, of the constant struggle and the quiet triumphs. She thought of the man inside the cabin and the sister tending to the child in the garden. Happiness was such a simple word for such a complicated, hard-won thing. She turned back to Miss Albright, her gaze clear and steady. "Happiness isn't something you find, like a lost coin," Eliza said, her voice soft but sure. "It's something you have to build, and then you have to choose it, every single day, even when it's hard." She looked toward the garden where Clara was now laughing as Samuel tried to pull up a carrot. "And you can never, ever choose it alone." That night, long after the lamp was lit, Clara sat at the table, a new leather-bound journal open before her. She had traded a month's worth of sewing money for it in town. It was her one luxury, her secret sanctuary. While Eliza built their present with her needle and Caleb built their future with his hammer, Clara was determined to reclaim their past. She began to write, her elegant script filling the blank pages, not with a recitation of sorrows, but with an accounting of their journey. October 1885, she wrote. "A year has passed since Samuel was born of fire and fear. When I first came to this place, I thought I was a ruined thing, a story that had ended in disgrace. I was wrong. My story, our story, was only just beginning. We are three people with scars the world can see, and more that it cannot, for a long time. I thought those scars were a mark of shame, but I see now that they are simply a map of where we have been. They are the proof that we have survived. The world wanted to write our story for us, to cast us as the widow, the harlot, and the sinner. But here, in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, we have taken back the pen. We are writing our own tale, a story of how three broken people learned to make a whole heart. This is the chronicle of how we won back the freedom of our own souls." The outside world intruded one last time, not with a threat, but with an olive branch. The mail rider, a young man who now tipped his hat respectfully, brought a letter. It was from the East, addressed to Caleb. The handwriting was elegant and unfamiliar. He took it with a sense of foreboding. He had not had contact with his family back in Ohio since before his own wife and son had passed. He thought that part of his life was as dead as the people he had buried. He sat on the porch steps, turning the envelope over in his hands, before finally breaking the seal. It was from his older sister, Mary. She wrote that she had heard, through a convoluted series of letters from distant cousins, a garbled and dramatic tale of his life in Wyoming. She had heard of a fire, a new child, and a new, unconventional living arrangement. "It is not for me to understand the ways of the world, brother," she wrote, "or the paths God sets for us. But I have prayed for you these long, silent years, and I know the goodness of your heart. Whatever life you have built, it is your own. I would very much like to meet your family. Please consider this a heartfelt invitation to bring them all to visit us in the spring. When the passes are clear, we have more than enough room." Caleb read the letter once, then twice. Family, his sister, a pillar of her church, a woman of propriety and tradition, had used that word. She had heard the whispers and the scandals that must have traveled 1,000 miles, and she had responded not with judgment, but with an invitation, an acceptance. He sat there for a very long time, the letter resting on his knee. As the sun began to dip below the western horizon, he thought of the man he had been, a hollow shell of grief, a man who spoke only to his horse. He thought of the ghosts he had lived with, the silence he had wrapped himself in like a shroud. And then he thought of the noise and chaos and heartbreak and fierce, stubborn life that had invaded his world. He thought of Eliza's quiet strength, Clara's defiant fire, and the small, chubby hands of his son. A slow smile spread across his face. It was not the ghost of a smile, the twitch of a memory, but a genuine, deep, and peaceful expression of a man who was, against all odds, finally whole. He laughed, a low, rusty sound at first, then a full, warm chuckle that rolled out across the quiet twilight. Later, as the last light of the day bled across the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The three of them sat together on the wide porch of the finished cabin. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. Samuel, tired from a long day of exploring, was crawling at their feet, his small grunts a contented counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. They sat, as they often did, in a configuration that had become their natural state. Eliza leaned her head against Caleb's strong, solid shoulder, her hand resting on his knee. Clara, sitting on the step below them, leaned back, her head resting against Eliza's side. They watched the first stars begin to prick the darkening velvet of the sky. There were no vows spoken, no promises for a future they could not predict. The wooden rings still sat on the mantelpiece inside, silent symbols of an oath that needed no words. Their commitment was not a single, binding promise made before a preacher, but a million tiny choices made every single day. The choice to chop the wood, the choice to mend the shirt, the choice to plant the flower, the choice to soothe the crying child, the choice to stay. Eliza sighed, a soft sound of pure contentment, and settled more deeply against Caleb. Clara reached up and her hand found Eliza's, their fingers lacing together. They were a strange, impossible, beautiful family. A constellation of 3 stars burning brightly in the vast, lonely darkness of the west. They had each chosen, and they would continue to choose, every single day, to simply be here, together, under the wide and merciful sky. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales from the frontier, and share your thoughts on Caleb, Eliza, and Clara's journey.